Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
So today we're doing something a little bit different, I think, than what we've done in the past. We've got a couple of faculty on here with us from the School of Environment and Natural Resources who conducted the 2020 Ohio Farm Poll. And it's really interesting, the results that they came out with. Looking back at 2019, I think that you as farmers will find some interest in that and hopefully learn a few things from this that you can take forward and improve your farm businesses and home life as well. We'll get into a little bit of that. So let's go ahead and do introductions. Doug, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm Doug Jackson Smith. I'm a professor in the School of Environment and Natural Resources and been with Ohio State for about 5 years now.
And I'm Shoshanah Inwood. I'm an assistant professor and rural sociologist in the School of Environment and Natural Resources with both a research and extension appointment.
Well, thank you both for joining us today. So this poll, you reached about 900 farmers with it. Is that correct?
That's right. So what we set out to do about a year ago is collect a random sample of farms from across the state of Ohio and get a good representative sense of what was going on at that time on the farms. As you know, as we've talked, the initial idea was coming off of 2019, which was a really tough year for a lot of farmers in terms of weather and commodity markets, getting a sense of how people were impacted by that and how they responded and how that was working out for them was the initial goal. Of course, we didn't know anything about COVID when we wrote the survey and we put it out in the field, but we can talk a little bit about that maybe at the end.
You guys are going to be putting out some information on this here, hopefully by the time we release this podcast, but it does look like you really hit a diverse group. You've got people from all across the state in different, you had categories, other livestock, dairy, hay, specialty crops, cash grains. There's a fair number of responses, of course, based on the region, you see more, but like Northwest, Southwest, Ohio, higher percentage of grain farms, but then you get into Eastern Ohio and a fair number of livestock and things like that.
I think one of the things that's worth emphasizing, I'm really impressed with how diverse Ohio agriculture is. And if you drive, I've had a chance now to get around most of the state and to see what different landscapes are like, what different kinds of farms dominate in different places. I know as somebody who studies agriculture and I know a lot of the folks who work in survey research here that we've given a lot of attention, particularly to Northwestern Ohio with all the interest and concerns around Lake Erie. But information about the full spectrum of farms from across the state has been a little hard to come by. And so we really set out to try to capture the full spectrum, the full range of diverse farms that we have.
So you guys kind of broke this down into three major findings. So Doug, do you want to go into what those are? Give us an overview and then we'll dive into each one a little bit more.
I think the first is that 2019, as hard as it was, did help serve as a stress test for the state to get a sense of where farms were vulnerable, where farms were thriving. And that, I think, speaks to long-run issues that the state wants to deal with insofar as it's trying to strengthen opportunities for agriculture to remain a key part of Ohio. The second thing really is this diversity, that farms experience the weather and the price impacts quite differently depending on their type of farm, their farm size, and even the region of the state that they lived in. And so there's no one story that tells the results of what that year meant to Ohio agriculture. And I think the final piece is really critical, and that's that the well-being of farms hinged quite a bit on what was going on in their households. And so those two things are intimately linked. And we really saw how adapting to the stresses in 2019 required support from and turning to the household. By the same token, things going on in the household were equally important drivers of well-being and stress on farms, things that were not a part of the farm economy, but that definitely affect farmers were quite clear in the results of the survey.
Yeah, those are all really interesting points and some things maybe we don't consider as much as we should when we're looking at this. You mentioned the stress test and what that revealed as far as strengths and weaknesses. One that I saw was large farms were more delayed in planting. But then I was thinking, will they also often start earlier as well? So what are some of those stress test topics that you saw really come out?
Well, I do think to connect that stress test with the farm type, we saw larger farms and farms that, certainly are corn and soybean operations, being the most impacted by weather, having the most effect on their planting, having the most effect on their yields. These are also larger farms do tend to farm more intensively and be pushing the limits or the outer limits of what we're able to do in agriculture. And so they have systems that are quite sensitive to these major impacts that can occur. And so they perhaps smaller farms or farms with more diverse crop rotations and so forth experienced it differently. But that's a reflection of how they farm and what their farm is normally doing and what they're capable of doing.
One other point that I found interesting was looking at the price received for products. And in that graph, you see that it kind of increases, the significant drop increases with the size of sales, but then it drops off at that higher level. So I don't really know what that means or how to interpret that necessarily, but you kind of see it stair step up to about the 250 to 999,000, and then it didn't seem to impact the $1 million or more sales as extensively. Just thought that was an interesting observation. I don't know if you guys have any comments on that.
Well, we're not entirely sure why, but it certainly has to do with the increased prevalence of very large farms often being involved in markets that have been contracted or hedged. And so they've protected themselves using tools against price drops, or are, have established relationships where they might not have been as vulnerable to the kinds of things that were changing in 2019.
I was going to say another thing that might be helpful to remember is that Ohio is really diversified in its farm size and type. And what we often forget is that the majority of farms are actually small and medium-sized farms. That even though the larger farms produce the majority of farm sales, they're actually the smallest number of farms in the state. So it's also really helpful, I think, to step back and think about what were the implications for the different types of farms and how many farms there were across the state, and not just concentrate only on the largest farms.
Yeah, that's a good point too. And I think this is good information for farmers to take in, and also for us as educators that we can use to address issues and help farmers become more successful.
Yeah, because in some ways, being a little bit smaller, what we saw in 2019, or having more diversified crops and markets actually protected you a little bit when there was really a cataclysm of different events that happened, not just the rain, but then also issues with markets and trade, many of which were outside of a farmer's control, and having a wider range of options of markets, and then also crops that could be planted and harvested at different times helped to buffer those impacts a little bit.
Yeah, and that kind of gets us into that point number 2 of farm diversification, and that came through as a strength. And I think we know this, the old saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket, but that's kind of what we've trended towards with corn and soybean production in Ohio. It definitely helps with efficiency, but when things go sideways, there's not much to fall back on. Yeah. What else did you find with that diversification?
I think Shoshanah said it well, that one of the things that we definitely see is that there has been some shift towards diversification of some practices on Ohio farms, but the long-term trend has definitely been towards efficiency and scale and specialization. And I think if we learn anything in 2019, it's a reminder that while that's tremendously important for maintaining output and providing efficient, affordable food, it does increase our vulnerability to extreme weather. And as we learned in a couple of years there, dependence on global markets can also come back to bite you if we get caught up in debates and politics around trade. And I think Ohio farmers that are dominating some of the large specialized production systems found themselves to be a little bit more exposed to that than many of the farms in the state that aren't really participating in those programs as much, or sell into different markets, or have a more diversified portfolio.
Yeah. And to follow up on what Amanda said, I think that insight you had that, the one constant in agriculture is change, right? We know every year is different. You can't go by what happened last year for so many different reasons. And that's a strength, right? And we want to promote that strength when we're thinking about programs and policy, is that when we have a lot of different types of farms that are producing different types of crops and different types of markets, whenever there is any particular shock, then not everybody's going to be vulnerable at the same time. So we're actually a much stronger state and a much stronger farm economy and farming system when we have more diversity in it. So that actually makes us much, much more resilient in the long term.
Yeah, I think the results of the survey are really helpful, because even if, you fall in a certain category of farm, you can look and see what different aspects of different types of farms might be benefits that you can find a way to incorporate into your own operation. Diversification is a great example of that. How to strengthen your own farm.
Well, I was just going to say, I think we could also take that diversity into the social world, right? And looking into the households. And we saw a lot of different ways in which farms are not only structured, but also how they responded to that stress, and just how important families and households were in surviving.
So those are great points, Shoshanah. And I thought that was one of the most interesting things that jumped out to me, was how important the household was to the success of farms when we were in these high stress years. So do you want to explain a little bit more what you learned from that aspect?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of times we're really comfortable talking about farm economics, just only focusing on the enterprise budget and not really thinking about how does it intersect with the family and the household budget. And the reality is that we know that the majority of farms in Ohio are family-based operations, which means, of course, that the family and the business are going to intersect and overlap in terms of values and how the business is structured. And what we were able to do with this survey is to really hear from Ohio's farmers of just how embedded households are in the farm economy. So in a really bad year, we heard from 40% of Ohio farmers that they relied on household savings to meet their farm expenses. And more than a third delayed purchases for the farm business and cut back on household spending. So we could really actively see the ways in which the household was really subsidizing the farm business. And that's really important. So as we're thinking again about programs and policies and the way that we're guiding farmers about the decisions they're making for their enterprise, that it's really important to actually take into account that household priorities and values. The other thing that we also saw that we often tend to not always pay attention to was when we asked about the stresses within for the farm, we're really familiar with, and over half of farmers said, yes, weather and farmland costs were a really big issue. But over a third also said that healthcare costs are a really big stress and cause of concern for the farm business. And again, that's something that we don't often pay attention to. And what is something else that the state really has to reconcile with is that we have an aging and shrinking farm population. And for farm production, it's really important to have healthy farmers. And what we saw from our survey is that almost 60% of Ohio farmers have a family member with a pre-existing or chronic health condition. And that makes it hard to do farm work. And we actually had 1 in 3 farmers tell us that somebody in their family had a health condition that makes it difficult to work on the farm. And that's going to affect farm profitability and farm viability. So it's going to be really important, again, as we're thinking about the economics of the farm, of how do we move, again, not just beyond the crop budget, but also to be thinking about these very real household and people issues.
Yeah, and I think another thing that really that household income can bring too is, health insurance. When you talk about those pre-existing conditions, in the farm world, finding insurance, it's gotten easier in recent years, but that off-farm job, that's definitely something that it often brings to the table for farm families.
Yep, definitely, Elizabeth. And that's something that we kind of have taken for granted, is that either the operator or family member is going to be working off farm, not only for that added income that can help buffer in a rough year, but also for those benefits. And that's a really important issue because it takes time and energy away from the farm business. It can add additional stress as people are trying to maintain their off-farm job and not get fired from that job in order to maintain benefits. And so I think that this is a really important conversation that we have to start addressing with a little bit more directly of how does healthcare, access to health insurance, the cost of those issues of healthcare and health insurance really affect our farming system.
Yeah, so I think, this survey really drives home a lot of important points. Do you guys have some recommendations that you've developed for folks like our listeners that may help them be more resilient to years like 2019 in the future?
Sure, I'll throw out a couple of things. I think one size certainly does not fit all when it comes to thinking about how to address the needs of Ohio agriculture. So having a diversity of programs, a diversity of policies, resources that are targeted towards farms that produce different commodities. We really have those needs throughout the state, and supporting farms of different sizes and types gives the state as a whole a little bit of a buffer or resilience in the face of changing markets and changing weather and so forth that we expect to come down the road. There's a lot of public policy invested in helping protect farmers from shocks, but a lot of it right now is money spent to, I think, really compensate for some of the risks associated with specialization. And what we saw in 2019 and again in 2020 are significant public expenses to help make farmers whole who suffered quite a lot from that. There's good questions about how long that can continue, but certainly a parallel approach, certainly not a substitute for it, would be to encourage or justify ways of supporting and strengthening farms that are doing different things and diversifying away from just that one model. And as I get around the state, I think there's quite a lot of interest among farmers who are trying those different things and seeing programs and policies be supportive of what they're trying to do as well. That might be more diverse crop rotations, getting involved in a more integrated crop and livestock approach, or expanding into new kinds of markets as opposed to kind of global markets as ways of spreading the risk and finding opportunity for 21st century agriculture to thrive.
Mm-hmm. And I think for the state to really focus on young and beginning farmers, because we need them desperately, is to really think about how is our agricultural policy really dovetailing with our rural development policy and different initiatives. So we need to really be thinking about this as a workforce attraction and retention issue. So what is the quality of life in our rural communities? What's the quality of schools and healthcare services? What is the broadband access like? When we think about that issue of health insurance, one of the things we know is that farmers are actually overall pretty well insured, but that's largely through an off-farm job. And in rural areas, we have to think about the majority of good paying jobs with good benefits tend to be in the public sector, health, education, government. And so it's also just really important when we're doing that sort of planning across the state for us to be thinking about what types of jobs, what types of benefits are going to be available within these rural communities that can also support the farm sector, because we're really seeing that how they're really linked together. They're not isolated from one each other.
Yeah, so we really appreciate you guys sharing some of the highlights of this work with us today. For our listeners that may want to dig in a little deeper and check out the report in detail, where could they find this information at?
It's a great question. Some of this is hot off the press in terms of being ready to share, and we're posting in conjunction with the Knowledge Exchange here in our College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences at Ohio State. We're going to post some summary reports and resources that come directly from the farm poll, and then in the coming weeks, we'll be able to put more of that stuff on our own websites. And if possible, we'd love to put links to that on your podcast website so people can go there and link directly to it. Another thing I might point at is last year, Dr. Inwood and I put out a report that summarizes really 20 years of census data about how is Ohio agriculture changing. And there's a neat trends report there that puts 2019, 2020 kind of into historical perspective. It always is a crisis of the moment in agriculture and in society, but when you step back, some of the things that we see going on are really a reflection of long-term trends. And if we want to look long-term into the future, we need to learn from that and think about how we can calibrate and direct agriculture, in particular in Ohio, in a way that's going to be really thriving in the future.
And one other follow-up is we just really wanted to thank all the farmers of Ohio and the farm families who took time out of their very busy schedules to fill out this survey and share with us the real issues and challenges and opportunities that they see. And Amanda and Elizabeth, we really appreciate you giving us the opportunity to share back out those results so that the whole state knows what's happening within this community.
Yeah, I think it's a really cool project. And like I said, great information to learn from. It'll be interesting to see over the next few years as the next generation comes on board and how those farms change and adapt to what we've been seeing here the last couple of years. So thank you both for your time.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, podcast listeners, just a reminder to give us a like or subscribe so you know when we release new episodes. If you're enjoying the podcast, be sure to leave us a review also. We appreciate the comments.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.